What's going on, guys? Dare here with Fantasy Football Advice, coming at you with another fantasy football video. Today, we got a good one, my personal favorite video to make. It's the wide receiver trade targets heading into week 3. We will of course have your buy low targets, your sell high players. Obviously, if they're buy lows, we do think that their value today is much lower than we think it will be for the rest of the season. Flip that in reverse for the sell highs. These players, we're either trading them away to mitigate risk, or the season long outlook for them may not be as bright as what we've seen from them in the first 2 weeks. Timestamps in the description below. Feel free to use those. You can skip right to the part you want. The intro being a tad bit longer in today's video because Nick and I have been fielding a ton of questions from people that are losing out on value by selling on players at quite possibly their lowest value of the season. One trend you may notice from both last week's as well as this week's trade target videos, that being the sell high list, it's going to be much smaller than the buy low list. And no, it's not by coincidence. There are a few reasons for it. A, we don't want to overreact too much to 2 weeks of NFL play. At this stage of the season, the reactionary move can oftentimes come back to bite us. In trading away players we just invested highly in a few weeks ago for pennies on the dollar now, it can certainly come back to bite us. For that reason, typically at this stage, I do hold pat on any players that are underperforming. Of course, we should always be selling high on players, so only trading them after good matchups if possible. But even deeper than that, I think we all should be looking at our rosters at this point of the season and not hyper focusing in on the players that we need to trade away due to underperforming, and instead put that focus onto the players on our roster that performed their best this past week, because those are the players that if you're going to make a trade, those are the ones you're getting max value for. Many of the trade questions we've received over the past week have been including players like Saquon Barkley, Najee Harris, Justin Jefferson, and while I get it, those players did underperform. If I owned either of those players, I'm not trading them because why would we? We're only getting a fraction of the value. This a roundabout way of explaining why our sell high list a bit shorter than our buy low at this stage of the season, and if you're ever unsure if your player is overperforming, underperforming, or maybe right on par, we recommend utilizing our rest of season rankings. If you have a wide receiver on your team performing as the wide receiver 32, then in the rest of season rankings, we have him ranked as the wide receiver 15. You definitely shouldn't be selling low on that player. In fact, we're probably targeting them as a buy low candidate. So be sure to check that out. That's at our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. Link is always in the description. And while you're there, check out more trade targets. We have more wide receivers than I'm able to fit in today's video, more running backs than Nick could fit in his video yesterday as well. Not to mention the full waiver list, the droppable players, week 3 streaming options, the week 3 rankings, DFS picks, sports betting picks. It's really your one-stop shop, so be sure to check that out for week 3. But with that being said, let's hop over to our stat of the day. Yesterday's stat of the day was among the 5 players with at least 50% of their team's air yards. Just one of them has fewer than 110 receiving yards. Which player was that? The correct answer, DeVonta Smith. The correct answer, DeVonta Smith. Congratulations to Gerard Roberts, the first to get this right on YouTube. And as for Twitter, at GerardAllen72. As for today's stat of the day, a similar wide receiver question. Excluding DeVonta Smith, which other wide receiver ranks outside the top 45 despite being top 15 in both percentage of team air yards as well as percentage of their team's targets? Once again, that's excluding DeVonta Smith. Which other wide receiver ranks outside the top 45 despite being top 15 in percentage of team air yards and percentage of team targets? Leave your answer in the comment section down below. We'll be happy to let you know who wins in tomorrow's video. Alright guys, without further ado, let's get into everybody's favorite players, the buy low targets. These are going to be the players that you try to acquire, the underperformers that are in for a better rest of season. And to start us off, I have 3 players that are going to be on the higher end. These are going to be the wide receiver 1 targets, the obvious players, the ones that even though they're underperforming at this stage, the owners, they're unlikely to trade them away unless you give them a significant offer, because as much as the fantasy draft a few weeks ago has little impact on how our players are going to perform, but as mentioned, since it was just a few weeks ago, many people are going to be hard pressed to give up some of their top targets in the draft, those 2nd, 3rd round picks. If you are going to trade for them, you're going to have to pay up. The further removed we are from the draft, the easier it will be to obtain high draft capital players, but at that point, if they're exhibiting this lack of production for a sustained period of time, are we really interested in trading for them anyway? Probably not. However, I feel really confident in the 3 to 4 players we have listed above. They're studs, all drafted within the top 12 at their position. We have DK Metcalf, AJ Brown, Calvin Ridley, and Justin Jefferson. As crazy as it is to believe, only one of these wide receivers listed here through 2 weeks is actually ranking within the top 30 at the wide receiver position, and that's Justin Jefferson. In PPR leagues, he currently stands as as the wide receiver 25. Looking at Calvin Ridley though, the next highest ranked receiver, he's coming in as the wide receiver 30 in PPR. Behind him, DK Metcalf, the wide receiver 33, and AJ Brown rounding out this list, coming in with an abysmal ranking of the wide receiver 47. Out of all four, I still do believe that the most difficult to obtain in a trade is likely going to be Calvin Ridley. It all of course depends on the owner, but if I had to rank them in difficulty, I would put Justin Jefferson right behind Calvin Ridley, DK Metcalf in a close third behind Justin Jefferson. Then the easiest of the wide receiver 1 trade targets that you could possibly nab this week, I would definitely put that at AJ Brown. Speaking of AJ Brown, him being the easiest to nab, it comes down to a few factors. First of all, straight up, he has the lowest fantasy output of all 4 of these wide receivers, meaning the owners, when starting them, they were the ones disappointed the most from the lack of production. In addition to that, the Tennessee Titans passing offense when compared to all these other passing offenses, Seattle Seahawks, Minnesota Vikings, both of those teams, they have had success through the air, just unfortunately they are being overshadowed by other receivers in their offenses. And although you could say something similar for AJ Brown when it comes to Julio Jones, who did outproduce him last week, it's really comparing apples to oranges because Ryan Tannehill has been absolutely abysmal through the air. Yes, we're expecting him to turn around, but through 2 weeks he only has 1 passing touchdown. Compare that to last season, 2020, where he started off the season with 6 of his first 7 games going for multi-TD passes, so night and day different from offensive efficiency through the air. But when it comes to Ryan Tannehill, we do have a large enough sample to trust him. I do strongly believe he will come back, so while there is additional risk in taking AJ Brown over some of these other wide receivers when it comes to targeting them in a trade, I do feel fully confident that AJ Brown from a season-long perspective should hit our projections, which is a back-end wide receiver 1. His road and pathway to reaching that goal though may be a bit bumpier than some of the others that I just listed. I am more concerned that AJ Brown misses time due to injury than I am that he underperforms in this offense, with him having the most extensive injury history. He also does have an injury designation with a questionable tag heading into this week 3 matchup. But if you're looking for a bona fide wide receiver 1, you're trying to upgrade the fantasy output that your starting lineup produces, AJ Brown's definitely the player that I would target. And with his next 3 matchups being against the Indianapolis Colts, New York Jets, and Jacksonville Jaguars, I wouldn't be surprised if by the end of week 5, AJ Brown was already ranking inside the top 15. Moving over to Justin Jefferson and DK Metcalf, these are 2 players we can almost compile together because their situations are so very similar. Both players, while disappointing, have produced in each of their first 2 matchups in PPR leagues, posting double-digit fantasy points in each contest, which is important to bring up because when making a trade and making an offer, discussing this player, you have to approach the trade knowing that your opponent who's been starting this player hasn't had complete duds, they haven't been an anchor to this player's roster. While motivated, don't send a lowball offer. They know what these players' values are, but with both players having another wide receiver on their offense that's outproducing them, Adam Thielen, Tyler Lockett, currently ranking as the wide receiver 2 and wide receiver 4 alike. For that reason, I do think that these players are very much attainable. And from a season-long perspective, while Tyler Lockett and Adam Thielen, I do fully expect to perform as top 30 wide receivers, I do expect things to shake out in the favor of Justin Jefferson and DK Metcalf, much like they did last season. Tyler Lockett, though, Adam Thielen, clearly not going to be as boom or bust as they were last season, which is a positive note for both of their offenses, another boost to both Justin Jefferson and DK Metcalf. But it's a completely reasonable reaction for your opponents that own these players to be a bit concerned with the heightened production of each of those players. It has come at the expense of a player they've invested highly in. Not only do they show no signs of slowing down, but they've outproduced a player that they've invested highly in for 2 straight weeks now, making this the perfect week to trade for each of them because it only takes 1 bust from Tyler Lockett or Adam Thielen with a simultaneous boom game from their wide receiver for their fate to be fully restored. That could happen as early as this week, so I'd take advantage if you're weak at the wide receiver position or looking to upgrade. Both players we value as a top 10 wide receiver for the remainder of the year. DK Metcalf with the slight edge, more of a top 7 wide receiver. And speaking of top 7 wide receivers, our final high-end player we have is Calvin Ridley of the Atlanta Falcons. I've spent enough time on these high-end players though that I'm not going to harp on Calvin Ridley. As mentioned, I do value him as the highest of all 4 of these wide receivers, so if you could pick one of them to target, this would be the one, but in turn, he's also probably the most expensive, at least in my opinion. If I owned all 4 of these wide receivers, he would be the one I'd least want to give up. But through 2 weeks, he's only scored in 1 contest, been held to 63 yards or under in both, so if there were a time to trade for him, now would be the time. Before we move into the back end tier of buy low targets, I do want to give a couple honorable mentions of players that didn't make this list, not because I don't think you shouldn't trade for them, but because you're not necessarily buying low. This is just going to be straight buys. And to start this list, we have Mike Williams of the LA Chargers. If you followed our content throughout the offseason, then you know that Mike Williams was a mid-round target that we definitely supported. Throughout his career, he'd already proven to have a 1,000-yard season under his belt. In another year, he had a double-digit touchdown season under his belt. He hadn't been able to put both together in a single season, but with the best talent at quarterback he's ever had throughout his career, it was easy to see a potential breakout for his 2021 season. Now, through 2 weeks, we've gotten a glimpse of that upside. He's posted 20-plus fantasy points in back-to-back weeks in PPR leagues, currently ranks as the wide receiver 5 in PPR, and so long as he's able to avoid injury, we don't see why he can't sustain wide receiver 2 production for the remainder of the season. With Mike Williams' track record throughout his career of being an injury-prone player as well as being an inconsistent player, I could easily see teams viewing him as a sell-high player and selling him for a top 30 wide receiver, maybe pushing it, maybe asking for a player somewhere in the wide receiver 20 to wide receiver 30 range. In that case, I think you're getting fair value for him, and Mike Williams has already proven to have that game-breaking upside in a week, the type of player that not only you would love to have in the flex, but one you could confidently trust in your wide receiver too if this level of production could sustain itself. He has a very difficult matchup against the Kansas City Chiefs in week 3, but if he destroys this matchup, then good luck getting him in a trade for that price. If he disappoints though, I'm definitely throwing offers out there for him. I still will this week as long as the owner doesn't value him too high. One thing to keep in mind though is we can't forget Mike Williams. He's an injury prone player. Expecting him to remain healthy for the entire season is just a fool's mission, and with Mike Williams we know he starts games but sometimes never finishes them, so just be aware of that if you're trading for him this week. Moving into the next buy player we have, and the final buy player we have is DJ Moore of the Carolina Panthers. If you followed our content throughout the offseason, you know that DJ Moore was a player that we were particularly high on, but we didn't think he would get off to such a hot start. With Sam Darnold moving from the New York Jets, Robby Anderson having ties to the New York Jets already have built chemistry with Sam Darnold, posting a 1,000-yard season with Sam Darnold, it was easy to see that for an inexperienced quarterback on a new offense, for him to lean on the weapons he's trusted, the weapons he's developed a chemistry with. So for the early portion of the season, Robby Anderson, we not only fully expected him to get off to a hot start, but that was going to come at the expense, presumably, of DJ Moore. Nobody told that to Moore, though, who has 19 targets through the first 2 weeks, currently ranking as the wide receiver 15. Sam Darnold looking pretty darn good himself, at least for fantasy. DJ Moore, while not buying low on him, he's a player that we feel very confident in from a season-long perspective, and definitely a player you can rely on to be consistent throughout the season. He is the ideal player you want to put in your wide receiver 2 slot. If you can somehow manage to get him in the flex or wide receiver 3 position, you're going to have a potential championship roster on your hands, at least from the wideout spot. And with his next 4 matchups being against Houston, Dallas, Philadelphia, and Minnesota, all 4 defenses that rank bottom 8 at defending opposing wide receivers, I wouldn't be surprised for DJ Moore to quietly and temporarily creep his way up into the top 12. Alright guys, I have 2 final players that are going to be much easier for you to get in a trade. First off, DeVonta Smith. You remember the stat of the day. This is a player that has top 5% of his team's air yards, yet despite that, he's the only wide receiver under 110 receiving yards. Expect that to change as Jalen Hurts gets more comfortable in this offense. He looks much more proficient than I had expected heading into the season. DeVonta Smith, a rookie wide receiver, and one thing we see consistently year over year when it comes to rookie wideouts is the production we get from them at the middle portion of the season towards the tail end of the season. It's much greater output than what we typically see in the early weeks. So DeVonta Smith, a player who we already got glimpses of in week 1, player who has 15 targets through 2 weeks, also playing on a team that's going to likely be playing from behind in many contests with a weak passing defense, meaning potential shootouts are in the future. He's the perfect type of player that you want to get now while his value is potentially at its lowest. That way you stash him, start him in positive matchups as he develops from a flex player into more of a wide receiver 3, potentially pushing wide receiver 2 production with the upside to post a Justin Jefferson-esque 2021 campaign. The final wide receiver we have is bargain bin shopping. It's Darnell Mooney of the Chicago Bears. Unless you drafted in Sleeper, Darnell Mooney, a late round wide receiver target, one that hasn't really been able to be trusted in the flex spot, so disappointed for anyone who drafted him in Sleeper leagues, and on all other platforms he's an afterthought, potentially making his way to the waivers. If he's on the waivers, no need to trade for him, but if not, he's the type of player that I would scrounge up some of my bench players, whichever players that I don't think have that upside to potentially crack my starting lineup, nor are they filling the depth for my roster. I would try to compile as many of those players as I could, put them together in a trade for Darnell Mooney, or if the Darnell Mooney owner has another player that you'd like to trade for, Mooney's the perfect subtle secondary asset to help even out the trade. They don't think much of it, but in reality, he's also a top target for you as well, so double win for you. When it comes to Mooney though, in week 1, he caught 5 of his 7 targets, in week 2, caught 6 of his 8 targets, so he is heavily involved in this offense. He's the second highest targeted receiver behind Allen Robinson. Allen Robinson, as we know, a bit disappointing, and with a new quarterback, Justin Fields, not not only does it bring in additional upside, transitioning from Andy Dalton to Justin Fields, a player that can make plays with his legs, but on top of that, a new quarterback needs potential change to distribution of targets, and Darnell Mooney, a player that doesn't need a change to that. He's already receiving a high enough volume total for him to have start-worthy type production, but if he sees any sort of uptick in the area of volume, Darnell Mooney could be an every week flex start and one that has upside because we already know that the talent's there. Expect the Chicago Bears to be in scoring position much more frequently under Justin Fields. It may be a bumpy ride over the next few weeks, as things always are with rookies in the early stages, but with Darnell Mooney not costing you anything more than a bench player, potentially a guy you can get off of waivers, he's the perfect upside target for people in deeper leagues or for the owner looking for a player that could potentially crack their starting lineup. Alright guys, we're moving into the two sell high candidates. As mentioned, we don't have many of them because if players are underperforming and I don't think that their season long value is accurately represented in these 2 weeks of play, then I'm just not including them on this list because I don't think you should be trading away players if it's a negative EV move. EV meaning expected value, and the first player on this list, we have Robby Anderson. This absolutely goes hand in hand with the DJ Moore take I mentioned. Unlike we had initially thought, Robby Anderson getting off to a hot start, he really hasn't gotten off to as hot of a start as we would have thought. In week 1, he only had 3 targets, caught 1 of them. That reception though was good for a 57-yard touchdown, so it saved his fantasy day. Also, for potential opponents in your fantasy league that may not be paying full attention, may not look at the targets, may just look at the end result, Robby Anderson in week 1 didn't bust. By all means, I believe that is fully a bust game. Had he not caught that pass, had he not caught that touchdown, Robby Anderson would have posted a big goose egg. Do you think if he posted a goose egg in week 1, followed that up with his week 2 production where he had 6 targets, catching 3 of them for 38 yards, a mere 6.8 fantasy points, do you reasonably believe that anybody in your league would potentially trade for Robby Anderson at that point if through 2 weeks he didn't catch the first touchdown, finish week 1 with a 0, follow that up with 6.8 fantasy points through 2 weeks? Absolutely nobody would be in the market for Robby Anderson in week 3. Despite that fact though, I do think there is a market for him still. If you can get flex value for him, potentially a top 20, top 30 wide receiver, I try and target somebody like Mike Williams. I think that would be perfect, but you may have to add an additional piece in. But with his next week matchup being against the Houston Texans, one of the worst passing defenses, Robby Anderson is definitely in line for a potential good game, so it's not as if you're going to be trading him away to a team that isn't going to get anything in return. Oftentimes when we trade players away heading into a bad matchup, it's less motivating for our trade partners to want to pull the trigger, but with him having such a great matchup against the Houston Texans, a game in which they'll be starting the backup quarterback, likely be leading for the entire game in time of possession, this is just one more motivating factor that could distract them from the subpar results we've seen in week 1 and 2. The final wide receiver sell high we have at this point, I'm not sure what you can get for him, but if you can get anything, especially Darnell Mooney for this player, I certainly would make the move. It's Christian Kirk of the Arizona Cardinals. Rondale Moore is definitely the receiver you want to own behind DeAndre Hopkins. Currently, Rondale Moore in PPR leagues ranks as the wide receiver 17, but Christian Kirk scoring 2 touchdowns in week 1, still putting up a somewhat respectable 9.5 PPR fantasy points in week 2, currently ranking as a top 24 wide receiver. I definitely think there could potentially be a market for Christian Kirk, and in the same light as I mentioned with Robby Anderson, he is heading into week 3 in a very positive matchup against the Jacksonville Jaguars. It's very beatable, much like in week 1. Yet another motivating factor to distract your opponents from doing the additional research and realizing Rondale Moore is the receiver you want to own and not Christian Kirk. But with him being such a low value player, not many people drafting him in 10-team leagues, 12-team leagues, he was a borderline draftable player. But after his boom week 1 production, I could see a lot of people adding him, much like Sterling Shepard, except Sterling Shepard in week 2, he also popped off in that week. Christian Kirk, he was trending downward, and at this point we've seen enough from this offense to know what's to expect moving forward, and unfortunately Christian Kirk is the odd man out. Like I mentioned, trading him for Darnell Mooney would be the ideal trade in my opinion, but if you're looking for more lower tier trade options, definitely go to our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. Check out some of our other positions: wide receiver, tight end, quarterback, and running back. They're not all going to fit in this video, but they're available at our website. But that's going to do it for this one, guys. We really hope you enjoyed. If you did, how about hitting that like button? If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. We thank you all for watching. We'll catch you on the next one.